Welcome everybody to another seminar from Heterodox Academy East Asia. Today will be Korean Scholarly Perspectives on Imperial Japan and the Asia-Pacific War. This webinar is a little different in that it will be bilingual with Korean and English. Our very own Andy Wondong Lee will provide translation assistance where needed. Apologies if my pronunciation of any of the Korean names or words is inaccurate at any point, by the way. So today's speakers will be our Shaun O'Dwyer, professor at Kyushu University. His research interests include moral and political philosophy and history of ideas, focusing on modern East Asia. We also have Junhyun Park, researcher at Koryo Saram Research Center, Jeonbuk National University. His research interests range over modern Japanese philosophy, history of modern Japanese philosophy, and moral thought. Then we have Chungjae Lee, visiting assistant professor of political science at Gettysburg College. His research in democratic theory and comparative political theory has been published in various peer-reviewed journals, and he will be joining the Department of Political Science at Bucknell University as an assistant professor of political science in the fall of 2025. And finally, we have Yu Tang Jin, assistant professor of political theory at the University of Hong Kong. His research interests include Chinese political thought and comparative political theory, with a focus on how Chinese intellectual legacies inform political thinking in China. So now, Shaun, I will hand the microphone to you to introduce more about your volume and a little more about the speakers. Take it away, Shaun.
Okay, thank you, Francis. So both the first two speakers, Junhyun Park and Chungjae Lee, they were contributors to this book, which I've edited and which was published by Routledge at the beginning of this year, Confucianism at War, 1931 to 1945. So the authors in this book explore a very under-theorized and a kind of understudied aspect of the sort of ideological grounding of empire and state building during the 1931 to 1945 era in East Asia, namely that Confucianism provided a very important cultural and symbolic resource for which was also heavily contested, of course, between intellectuals, political leaders, ideologues, who were developing, I guess, ideologies for legitimating modern state building, as well as Pan-Asianist ideologies for Japanese empire building in East Asia. Now, regarding that under-theorized aspect, so I guess for Japan, when people think about the sort of wartime ideologies which drove Japanese expansionism and militarism, the usual referent is Shintoism or state Shinto. And in the case of China, when people think about the sort of ideologies driving state building, they generally tend to think about nationalism, the Kuomintang, and the three principles of the people. So the purpose of this volume is to show that, in fact, Confucianism was a very important resource for these various intellectuals and political leaders and even military elites at this time. For mobilizing in actually very conflictual ways, of course, as this was during wartime. Now, regarding Heterodox Academy or Heterodox East Asia hosting this event, one of our important sort of principles is viewpoint diversity. And I think it's very important to point out that this aspect of wartime ideology, namely the mobilization of Confucianism, by very conflicting actors in China, Japan, colonial Korea, Manchuria, and so on, is very under-theorized in Japan, as well as in the wider sort of English-speaking scholarship in East Asian studies. There are a number of interesting reasons for this, but the fact is that most of the work being done on this topic is by Korean, Chinese, and Taiwanese scholars, and a couple of token Australians, and I think a couple of French people as well. So one thing we will be exploring this webinar as well is why in Japan there is not very much being written about this, at least by Japanese scholars, and also in the Korean setting, to explore, I guess, or to consider some of the sensitivities associated with studying intellectuals who were deemed or have been now deemed to be pro-Japanese traitors or so-called Chinilpa. So anyway, so I'll just finish my introductory in my introduction now, and I'll hand it over to our first speaker, Chungjae Lee, and his chapter for the book. And I'm just going to have to open the book to remind myself. Um, his chapter for the Confucianism War volume is titled "Reconstructing the Nation: A Critique of Confucianism in Li Guangsu's Political Thought." Okay, so over to you, Chungjae.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, so sounds good. It's a pleasure being here and thank you for inviting me over to this great event. So today's presentation, my presentation is going to be about the chapter in the book Confucianism at War, 1931 and 1945. And the chapter is about this kind of controversial figure in Korean political thought named Lee Gwang-su. I'm sure many of you know him as a novelist, but he was also independent activist and he also wrote these essays and declarations and so on and so forth. So he was kind of a versatile character. But what makes him controversial is that on the one hand, in his early career, he was actively participating in independence movement in colonial Korea and Shanghai, China. And he was one of the co-founders of provisional government there in Shanghai, China. So he has that side to himself. On the other hand, he was, after his imprisonment in 1937, he became quote unquote the traitor of the nation. And then he was actively involved in propagating Japanese imperial cult. So he has these two sides to himself. Now, what is interesting from my perspective, at least in this chapter, is that he was consistently critical of Confucianism, to be more specific, not Confucian philosophy, but Confucian culture throughout his career. So that is the chapter is about. Okay? Now, so this is outline. So I'm going to explain to you what he was to say about Confucianism in kind of four ways. So I'm going to talk about his early career work, especially written from 1910 to 1920s. And these are Korean names. Some of you may recognize it, but 신생활론 is like a new mode of living or new way of living. And then his most notoriously famous one is 민족개조론 or on national reconstruction. So I'm going to talk about these two essays. And then I move on to his mid-career work, including The Wife of a Revolutionary and Soil, where he talks about kind of new vision of Korea that was his envisioning. And then moving on to his later work on endorsing Japan's cause, including essays like Daitoa, I mean, these are written in Japanese, so like Greater Asia, and Chosen Bunka no Shorai, meaning, or written in Korean, or Chosen 문화의 장래, so future of Korean culture. And then I'm going to talk about implication of what he has to say about Confucianism, quoting, I think, quite an interesting passage from his confession written post-independence, which was 1948. And then we're going to Q&A session. So this is his early picture when he was young, when he was studying more within Japan and so on and so forth. I mean, my undergrad was in Wasa University and he went to the same university, so there's kind of connection there. So in Ethereum New Model Living, 신생활론, he equates the Confucian system of the previous dynastic order, meaning Joseon Si대 or Joseon dynasty, with a rigid social hierarchy and discrimination against commoners, asserting that every form of human existence requires adopting, adapting to new and unforeseen changes. So he was arguing that Confucianism is trying to argue that what he understood Confucian culture of Korean dynastic past was about fixating things, not allowing changes to happen, so that social hierarchy will remain intact. Now, according to Lee's perspective, this is entirely wrong, because from his perspective, there's no such thing as morality, ethics, laws, or habits that are eternal and universal. And then he refers to this idea of living, or 생활 in Korean, already evokes an imagery of life as water-like, constantly flowing and changing. So he was arguing that adapting to new changes, external world is natural thing, and Confucianism is wrong, not simply because of its tenets, but this tendency to fix things. And In his most notorious work, The Theory of National Reconstruction or on National Reconstruction, 민족 개조론, he proposed this project of national reconstruction, as in that this project is essential to the survival of Korean people as one nation against imperial and colonial powers, including Japan, and the first step of which entails stripping away from the vestiges of Confucian from the past, meaning that eliminating the Confucian culture and system from the country and the people's mind. Now, according to his view, this was entirely possible, meaning stripping away of the vestiges insofar as Confucianism characteristics of Korean people were of transient nature, accordingly amendable rather than being inherent and thus permanent. Now, in making this argument, he makes distinction between primary national characteristics, secondary national characteristics, and secondaries are these characteristics that can be changed, and primary are not things that cannot be changed, including like, for example, language. And secondary are something you can change. And according to his perspective, the secondary characteristics are Confucian characteristics that they can be changed. And this distinction is not of his own making, rather he borrows from Gustave Le Bon, a French sociologist who was quite influential at the time. The reason why he's adopting this distinction is that even Japanese intellectuals at the time adopted such a distinction. So he is using Japanese reasoning to argue against Japanese reasoning, if that makes sense to you. Um, Now, going back to the main point, Lee regarded Confucianism as foreign to the Korean nation rather than intrinsic to it. And for him, the project of national reconstruction fundamentally involved discovering and cultivating the cultural essence, meaning the primary national characteristics, recovering them, which in turn could transform the masses, meaning Korean people, into a political subject appropriate for a modern Korea to come. Now, moving on to his mid-period, I think natural question is then what does it mean by this new Korea? Like what does it entail? So that is the answer here. So meaning that in his mid-career, he's more into writing novels. And that is understandably why, because it was that persecution and surveillance and censorship. So novel was kind of better medium for him to address his concerns, right? And the book I would like to focus on, the novel is Soil or Hook. And the story is about this very humble family background person named Hudson, who is this persona, and he's a lawyer. So despite his humble beginning, he succeeds as a lawyer. So he has this good life ahead in front of him in Seoul, in Korea. However, he decides to move away from such a life, luxury life, and then he abandons his wife to rebuild Korean nation from the bottom, meaning that he goes down to his hometown, Seoul, to rebuild Korean nation from the bottom, meaning that Korean ordinary people. Um, and the main point of the novel is that, according to Hudson's perspective or Lee's perspective, the previous dynastic order, meaning Confucian dynastic order or Joseon dynasty, ingrained in the minds of the people a false belief that the ruling class is more fundamental to the nation's future than the ruled class in the name of Confucian social order, meaning that he's being critical of this idea that when making societal changes, elites are more important than common people. So he's rejecting the idea. So he's associating that idea with Confucianism. So Confucianism, from his perspective, is about when you were to change your society, elites should be in the vanguard, right? However, he's rejecting the idea by saying that when making societal change, you actually need to mobilize people, and this kind of people as a whole, ordinary people, they can actually challenge and change the entire society. So that's the argument in Hook or Soil. Um, Now, maybe the most interesting part of my presentation is his late work, which is written as Kaya Mitsuro, because he changed his name in the Japanese one after his imprisonment in 1937. So he's no longer Lee, but he's a new identity, right? And then he started to write these articles and declarations and speeches in favor of Japanese imperialism and colonialism. And his later writings in Japanese The logic of non-assimilation, so nationalistic side of it, Lee's early career, mid-career completely disappears and is replaced with blatant pro-assimilation. However, it is evident that he still critiqued Confucianism because still in his pro-Japanese writings, he argues that Confucianism was not only foreign to Korean nation, it had also lost its original moral impetus. On the contrary, Japanese culture was arguably identical to the Korean cultural tradition, the fact of which the Korean people had become unaware of due to the historical influence of Chinese cultural hegemony during Joseon Dynasty era. Thus, from Kayama or Lee's perspective, the Korean people's assimilation into the Japanese culture and acceptance of Japanese imperial way was in essence the restoration of the lost cultural foundation. It's important that it's not adopting new idea, but rather it's restoration. Becoming Japanese is kind of restoration of their old cultural root. So there's a distinction between adopting new thing and restoring thing. And he's arguing that, well, Confucianism is foreign to Korean people, but Japanese culture is not foreign to Korean people. So that's kind of logic he's trying to get at. Um, and one of the articles where you see this idea of assimilation is Daitoa or Greater East Asia. In this rather short novel, Lee speaks through the voice of the protagonist, saying that the Asian people, quote, must discard the arrogance of your past and humbly accept Japan's present superiority and leadership. The glory of your homeland's past is not your own. It is the glory of your ancestors. And from now on, you must build your own glory with your own strength. So meaning that accepting Japanese culture, system, ideas, and so on and so forth, it is about restoring your cultural foundation and you restructure yourself into a new being, a modern self. And you adhering to the past is kind of your arrogance. And it is not something that defines you, but rather defines your ancestors. You actually need to be a new self. Um, and just to summarize then, from this perspective, um, the protagonist, from his view, it is undeniable that Japan is the epitome of modernity, representing a stage of human development that no other Asian nation has ever attained. While China may have been at the center of the pre-modern worldview before its encounter with the West, that according to Lee's novel is no longer the case in the era of imperialism and colonialism in the early 20th century. And from his perspective, if the fundamental characteristics of human existence are shaped by adaptation to changes, so I mean, it rings a bell that we call from the part of we talk about the 신생활론 theory of new mode of living. He argues that the wrong of Confucianism was that it was resistant to change. Now he's arguing that, well, we actually need to change. And the rise of Imperial Japan as a new regional power in Asia is not inherently problematic. Rather, Japan is simply taking over China's previous role. To put it another way, Japan is undertaking a project that China failed to accomplish. That is the unification and prosperity of Asian peoples. Now, then, what's the implication? Now, Lee's making fairly troubling idea here. So this seemingly preposterous idea of pro-Japanese nationalism, meaning that you can be nationalistic, but you can be still pro-Japanese, right? So that idea. That However, I mean, this idea of pro-Japanese nationalism was not well taken by his contemporaries. Some were thinking to be the region sympathy, but other time it was other contempt. So his idea wasn't received well, arguably due to his transition in his later career. However, the takeaway here is that his call for the repudiation of Confucianism as a condition for the attainment of authentic Korean nationhood is kind of interesting because people, I mean, political theorists in general who study Korean culture tend to associate Korean culture with Confucianism, that there's something Confucian of Korean culture, whether in the past or contemporary, so kind of essence of Korean culture. Now, what Lee is trying to argue that is not. Confucianism is secondary, it's not intrinsic to Korean culture. Now, let me end my presentation with this quote I would like to discuss with you if you have time. So this is a section from his Confessions, Nai Go Back, written after independence, 1489. After he was being investigated by Special Committee of Korean government investigating Chinese power, pro-Japanese ethnic Koreans. And after being released, he wrote this book, trying to argue and try to explain where he was coming from. And I would like to pay attention to the highlighted part of the quote where he writes, the quote, most of our independence leaders have left the country, meaning Shanghai, China. This was exactly the thing that would throw Korea into the hands of the Japanese. Korea seemed to be devoid of independence leaders, and strengthening Korea itself seemed to be the proper path to take, not traveling around looking for the strength of others. So there are Korean scholars who understand Lee as a bourgeoisie cultural nationalist. So that's one way to understand it. Another way to understand it is that he was pessimist. I mean that he was pessimistic about having a revolution, violent revolution, and achieving self-determination. And he was deeply pessimistic. And he thought that the best way to do is become stronger, meaning that having this economic power and educating themselves, and then the colonized can talk about self-determination. The time will come. You actually need to await. You need to wait until that time comes. That is his pessimism. So that's all for my presentation, and thank you for listening, and I look forward to Q&A session.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation, leaving us lots to think about. Um, Now let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker uh, is our next speaker Junhyun Park, I believe.
Yes, yes.
Yes, all right. Let's move on to Junhyun Park then.
Hey, uh, is it okay that I speak by Korean, right?
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah, okay. Uh, just a moment. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can see your slides. Um,
Okay.
Andy, should we do the translation like slide by slide? What would be the easiest way to do this?
Sean, so was it that first Park proceed with his presentation in Korean, and then like at the end, maybe if there are questions that I intervene and then translate, was it that way?
Yes. So Junhyun's made his slides in with English explanations, and I've also circulated a copy of his chapter.
Ah,
Okay.
okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Junhyun, you can proceed.
네. 어, 일단 이런 발표, 기회를 주신 조셉 선생님하고 오드와이 선생님한테 감사를 드리고요. 그리고 이제 제 오늘 발표에 대해서 먼저 설명을 하자면은, 원래는 챕터의 13 챕터인 군자의 도에서 민중의 규제라는 저의 챕터를 소개하려고 했는데, 거기에 앞서서 일단 흔하지 않은 연구 분야라고 볼 수 있는 제 연구 분야다 보니 그것에 대한 기본적인 이야기와 그리고 설명을 하면서 이제 만약에 여유가 되면 이제 북챕터를 소개하는 편으로 가는 게 좋을 것 같아서 오늘 발표는 먼저 제가 연구하고 있는 이 진화 철학이라고 하는 일본에 있어서 당시 이데올로기로서 작용되고, 이데올로그들이 일본에 어떻게 보면은 당시에 주도적으로 선전으로서 사용했던 사상들이 어떻게 만들어졌는지에 대한, 어, 엘리트 층들의 사상을 한번 그 구조와 그게 어떻게 이루어지게 됐는가를 설명하려고 합니다. 먼저 앞서서 진화 철학이라는 단어를 제가 이야기를 했는데, 진화 철학이란 무엇인가 하냐면은 진화라는 한자는 이제 일본어 발음으로 시나라고 합니다. 시나는 우리가 영어로 생각하면 이제 시나 차이나가 되는데 일본에서 중국을 그 당시에 중국이라는 표현을 사용하지 않고 이제 시나라는 표현을 사용하였습니다. 뭐 이유는 여러 가지 이유가 존재를 할 텐데 뭐 가장 이거는 확실히 뭐 100%라고 얘기할 수는 없지만 대다수의 이유 중에 이제 중국이 세상의 중심으로의 국가가 아니다라는 이유로서 중국이라는 표현을 사용하지 않고 일종의 비하의 의미로서 시나라는 표현을 차용을 했다라고도 볼 수 있고 혹은 영미권이나 유럽 쪽에서 사용했던 차이나 시나라는 표현을 그대로 받아들였다라는 여러 가지 설이 있는데 이제 그 시나라는 표현을 사용해서 신화 철학이라고 불렸습니다. 이 신화 철학이 만들어지게 된 계기가 어, 참 어떻게 보면은 일본의 역사와 맞물리게 되는데 일본에서는 이제 메이지 유신이 있으면서 근대화가 이루어지면서 과거에 동양의 것이라는 게 모두 동양의 것이라는 거는 부태한 것, 쓸모가 없는 것으로 취급이 되면서 물론 한문학 또한 그 중에 하나로서 작용이 되게 됩니다. 그러면서 한문학을 배우려는 사람 혹은 한문학을 하려는 사람 자체의 숫자도 많이 들고 그러다 보니 한문학계에서는 그 위기를 감지하게 됩니다. 그래서 한문학도 근대화가 필요하다라는 주장이 나오면서 이제 서양의 방법론을 받아들이면서 철학으로서의 변모를 하고자 하며 그 이름을 신화 철학이라고 부르게 됩니다. 그 신화 철학이 이제 도쿄, 당시에 도쿄대, 그리고 제국대, 도쿄 제국대로 넘어가면서 여기에 있는 이제 철학과와 나중에는 신화 철학과로 불리게 되는 이 철학, 그 과에서 들어오게 되는데, 어, 잠시만요. 제가 슬라이드를 영어 슬라이드로 바꿔서 다시 그 공유를 하도록 하겠습니다. 음, 음. 그래서 이 신화 철학이라는 분야가 근대화된 한문학이라고 생, 근대화된 한문학이라는 생각을 하면 기본적으로 일단은 하고 가면 될 것 같고요. 그래서 누가 이 근대화된 한문학을 시작했냐 하면은, 이따가도 자세하게 소개해드릴 이노우에 데츠지로라는 학자 겸 이데올로그로부터 시작되게 됩니다. 잠시만 기다려주십시오. 아,
So he's changing into English slides. So just wait a second.
yes. I'm gonna share the English PowerPoint, so
Sure, no worries.
just wait. I'm gonna cancel the sharing and okay. Can you see, can you see my slide?
Yes, we can
Yes.
see that.
Okay, thank you. 그래서 이 진화 철학이라는 것이 나중에는 제가 이제 이 챕터로 쓰게 된 1930년대에는 어떠한 영향을 주게 되냐면은 황도라는 사상을 들고 나오게 된다. 아까 이충재 선생님께서 얘기하셨던 그 Imperial Way라는 게 이제 일본에서는 황도라고, 우리나라 말로 하면 황도, 일본에서는 포도라고 부르는 사상인데 이게 사실 이 진화 철학을 했었던 사람들만이 주장을 했었던 내용은 아닙니다. 어, 물론 예를 들어서 뭐 야스오카라는 학자도 있고, 그리고 또 니시다 기타로 같은 경우도 진화 철학에 대해서 직접적으로 논문에서 언급하진 않지만 그가 쓴 기사나 이런 데서는 황도를 또 긍정하는 경우도 있고요. 그러면서 여러 당시의 학계에 있는 사람들이 이 황도에 대한 이야기를 하는데, 이 황도라는 게 사실 딱히 구체적인 내용이 존재했었던 이론이 아니었어요. 당시에 황도라는 거는 뭐, 일본의 우수성을 알리기 위한, 그리고 어떻게 보면 그냥 왕도의 단순한 비교군으로서의 사상이었는데, 이제 이거를 사상적으로 이제 담론으로서 발전시킨 인물이 제가 주로 연구 분야에 다루게 되고 이 챕터에서 다루는 인물이 다카다 신지라는 인물이 되겠습니다. 그러니까 황도 이론 자체를 어떻게 구조화를 시켰냐면은 이 보면은 원래는 왕도라는 것에 단순한 대조군에서 황도라는 것에 아무 내용이 없었던 황도라는 이론을 천명이라는 mandate of heaven이라고 되어 있는 천명이라는 이론과 정명이라는 이론을 합쳐서 이 구조를 가지고 황도라는 내용을 이제 만들어서 어떻게 보면 이론화시킨 인물이 오늘 제가 여러분들께 소개시켜 드릴 다카다 신지라는 사람이 되겠습니다. 자, 다카다 신지는 누구냐면은 이제 1893년에 태어나가지고 1975년에 사망한 중국 학자라고 주로 불리우고 있는 이제 진화 철학자인데요. 보면은 다카다 신지 옆에 괄호 치면은 한국 발음으로 읽으면 도헌이라는 이제 호를 가지고 있는 인물로서 이 도헌이라는 거는 진화 철학파에 있어서 굉장히 상징적인 의미를 가지고 있습니다. 일본어로 토켄이라고 하고 요거는 이 일대라고 볼 수 있는 이노우에 데츠지로부터 이어져 내려온 그 우리나라에서는 아호라고 해가지고 퇴계 이황하듯이 일본에서도 이제 한학자들한테는 이렇게 호를 붙여줬습니다. 이 다카다 신지의 경우는 어 오, 오이타 그 규슈 지방 쪽의 오이타라는 곳에서 태어나가지고 이제 도쿄 제국대학을 들어가서 도쿄 제국대 진화철학과를 나오고 그리고 미또 고등학교에서 당시 교수로 임용이 됩니다. 미또 고등학교에서 교수로 임용이 된다는 당시 일본의 고등학교는 현재로 치면은 일종의 후, 1, 2년 과정 정도로 생각을 하면 되는데, 여기에 있어서 교수로 임명이 되고, 그 다음에 이제 서른이 될 쯤에 케이조 임페리얼 유니버시티라고 적혀 있는데, 이제 경성제국대학교, 지금의 현 서울대학교에 조교수로서 임명이 되게 됩니다. 그러면서 당시 엘리트층 중에서도 그 정말 몇 안 되는 소수만 누릴 수 있었던 독일, 유럽, 그리고 중화민국으로의 유학길을 떠나게 됩니다. 그러면서 요 경성제국대학이 있을 당시에 다카다 신지의 여기에는 적혀 있지 않지만, 새로운 발견 중에 하나가 무엇이냐면은, 우리나라에서 서계라고 불리는 박세당 선생의 연구가 최초로 진행된 게 1950년대 이제 해방 이후가 되는데, 그것보다 빠르게 이제 연구를 시작한 인물이 바로 다카다 신지라고 보면 됩니다. 다카다 신지의 사문이라는 잡지 안에서 다카다 신지가 5편에 걸쳐서 그 박세당의 사변록이라는 저서를 읽고 그것에 대해서 연구를 한 논문도 실려 있는 것을 볼 수가 있습니다. 그리고 이제 유학이 끝난 후에 미국으로까지 유학을 갔다가 이제 도쿄 제국대학의 교수로서 임용되게 됩니다. 그리고 그가 도쿄 제국대학의 교수로 임용되면서 본격적으로 어떻게 보면 그의 이데올로그의 활동은 시작되게 됩니다. 그 전까지의 다카다의 연구 분야는 천명이라는 일본 유학에서도 어떻게 보면 천명이라는 거는 당연하지만 잘 다루어지지 않았던, 너무 당연하게 잘 다뤄지지 않았던 분야를 다카다의 경우는 박사 논문 낼 때까지 그의 연구 주제로 가져가면서 천명이라는 것을 연구를 하고 그리고 이제 교수가 되게 되는데, 천명을 연구한 이후에 다카다의 연구의 방향이 좀 더 이 철학 혹은 유학에 가까웠던 연구에서 멀어진다면 멀어지고 정치 철학, 뭐, 좋게 얘기하면 정치 철학, 나쁘게 얘기하면 이데올로기적인 부분으로 넘어가기 시작하게 됩니다. 그러면서 뭐, 다카다가 이제 도쿄 제국대에서 교수가 되고, 1939년에 특히 굉장히 중요한 이제 일을 하게 되는데, 여기 lecture on the Book of Han이라고 여기 1939년 적혀 있는데 이게 무엇이냐면은 어강서시라고 우리나라 말로 어강서시인데 이게 무엇이냐면은 천황이 자기가 배우고 싶은 분야의 학자를 불러서 이제 정월 초하루에 강연을 시킵니다. 이 강연을 시키는 거에 있어서 천황 앞에서 자신의 한학적 사상 이런 거를 강의하게 되는 게 어강서시인데 이제 어강서시를 하게 되고 뭐 중국으로 뭐 출장도 갔다가 하면서 이제 교수로서 활동을 하는데 이 다카다가 그러면 1945년까지 도쿄 제국대 교수로 있다가 이제 45년에 GHQ에 의해서 이제 전후에 그 교직에서 쫓겨나게 됩니다. 일단 제일 중요한 거는 이 교직에서 쫓겨나는 얘기까지이기 때문에 다카다 신지라는 인물이 이런 인물에다가 어떻게 보면은 3세대 그 당시 진화 철학으로 해서 3세대 학자인 인물인데 다카다 신지의 경우는 그 앞선 이제 앞으로 소개할 이노우에 데츠지로 핫토리 우노키치는 두 학자들에 비해서 훨씬 더 이데올로기적인 색도 강하고 그가 이야기한 모든 사상은 결국 45년까지는 황도를 향하게 됩니다. 그래서 이 북챕터에서도 얘기하는 내용은 결국에 황도의 일부로 들어가게 되는 정명에 대한 얘기를 이루어지게 되는 것이고요. 그리고 좀 더 진화 철학에 대해서 설명을 하자고 하면은, 요 페이지는 이제 다카다 신지의 저서 목록이 되겠습니다. 참고하시기 바랍니다. 뭐, 진화 철학에 대해서 좀 설명을 하자고 하면은, 이 진화 철학파라고 저는 명명을 하는데, 이 진화 철학파를 창시한 인물이라고 하면은, 이 바로 이노우에 데츠지로라는 인물입니다. 이 이노우에 데츠지로는 원래는 한학자에서 이제 개성학교라는 데서 한학을 배우면서 개성학교에서 한학을 배우면서 한학을 공부했었던 인물인데 이제 1877년 최초 도쿄 제국대학에 입학을 하게 되면서 일본인 이제 최초 도쿄 대학 당시에는 이제 제국대가 아니고 도쿄 대학의 입학생으로서 입학을 해서 역사, 철학, 정치학과라는 학과에 입학하게 됩니다. 그래서 공부를 하고 이제 1882년에 도쿄대에 조교수로 임용이 되게 됩니다. 그리고 독일로 유학을 갔다가 돌아오면서 이제 정식 교수, 어떻게 보면 최초 일본인 철학과 교수로 이제 도쿄 제국대 교수로서 임명이 되게 됩니다. 그는 이노우에 데츠지로라는 인물이 어떻게 보면 일본 철학사에 있어서 가장 중요한 인물로 저는 보는데, 이 이노우에 데츠지로의 경우는 아까 얘기했던 진화 철학파를 만든 인물로서 철학의 근대화라는 것, 도대체 한문학을 어떻게 하면 근대화할 수 있을까에 대해서 그 방법론을 만들었던 인물이고, 그가 했었던 이데올로기적인 활동, 물론 이런 활동을 하면서 이데올로기적인 활동도 했는데, 이데올로기적인 활동이 무엇이냐 하면은, 가장 유명한 거는 이제 교육치거라는 일본 당시에 이제 근대화를 성공했다라는 그 칙령을 천황이 우리나라로 치면 교육부 장관에게 내립니다. 그 칙령을 처음으로 해석하고 그것에 대해서 이제 이어서 국민도덕론이라는 거를 만든 국민도덕론이라는 걸 주창을 하면서 유학의 이데올로기화 그리고 일본의 어떻게 보면은 당시에 이제 메이지 유신부터 쇼와 시대 전쟁이 끝날 때까지의 일본의 일본을 관통한 유학 이데올로기라는 것을 정립한 인물로서 작용하면서 이 이노우에 데츠지로의 경우는 이 유학 이데올로기뿐만이 아니라 어떻게 보면 철학계에도 굉장히 큰 영향을 미칩니다. 우리가 지금 흔히 사용하고 있는 도덕이라는 번역어, 아니면 윤리라는 번역어, 아니면 뭐 여러 가지 여러분들이 철학을 공부하는 데 있어서 나오는 번역어들의 상당수가 이노우에 데츠지로에 의해서 번역이 됐으면서, 1944년에 그가 죽기 전까지 엄청난 저작 활동 및 그 이데올로그로서 활동 그리고 연구자로서 활동을 하였는데 그중에 재밌는 사건이 이 1926년에 있었던 어, 우리 국채와 국민 도덕이란 책에 이제 그가 23년에 은퇴하고 나서 25년에 다이토 문과 학부인이라는 데서 이제 그 총장을 하고 있을 때 그 25년 썼던 우리 국채와 국민 도덕이라는 책에서 그 불경 사건이 일어나게 됩니다. 뭐 일본의 뭐 상징적인 사실 신성시대는 물건들이 뭐 진짜가 아니다 이런 문구가 들어 있는데 그 사건으로 인해서 26년부터 한동안 모든 직에서 사퇴를 하고 어떤 직도 할 수 없게 됩니다. 그래서 이데올로그지만 참 재밌는 행적을 가진 인물이기도 한데, 이제 이 사람이, 이러한 이노우에 대치지로하는 인물이 초대 진화 철학파를 만든 인물이라고 하면은, 어, 그 다음, 이제, 에 있는 핫토리 오노구치라는 인물이 되겠습니다. 이 핫토리 오노구치라는 인물은 이 진화 철학파를 확장시키고 좀 더 확고하게 만든 인물이라고 볼 수 있습니다. 이 사람은 이제 1890년에 그 제국대학에 제국대학이 이제 도쿄대학에서 제국대학으로 이름이 바뀐 건데 제국대학의 철학과를 졸업하면서 제3고등학교의 교수가 되고 그 다음에 고등사범학교의 교수가 됐다가 어 철학과 이제 도쿄 제국대로 돌아가서 철학과의 교수가 됩니다. 그러면서 뭐 청나라로 유학을 가는데 당시 청나라 유학을 가서 하토리 우노키치 같은 경우는 과거 시험을 봐서 진사에 급제를 하고 어, 또 의열단 봉기에 휘말리게 됩니다. 그래서 하토리 우노키치에 의해서 만들어진 되게 재밌는 사건 같은 것 중에 하나가 하토리 우노키치 같은 경우는 여러 현대에도 남아있는 그 연구소 이런 데에 연구소는 학교에 영향을 많이 끼쳤는데 예를 들어서 이 당시에 이 의열단 사건에 의열단 봉기에 휘말려가지고 중국 정부에서 배상을 하토리 우노키치한테 한다 그랬을 때 그 배상금을 받는 대신에 연구소를 지어달라고 의뢰를 합니다. 그래서 현재 도쿄 대학에 남아있는 그 동아시아 연구소, 뭐 그리고 성균관대 연구소, 그리고 교토에 있는 일본문화연구센터 이런 곳에 이 핫토리의 의열단 봉기에 있어서 배상금을 받는 대신에 조건으로 짓게 된 연구소가 되고 또 이 이후에 독일로까지 유학을 갔다가 돌아오면서 핫토리 같은 경우는 이제 중국 진화 철학 주임을 맡게 됩니다. 당시에 핫토리 같은 경우는 이노우에 데츠지로와는 17년 정도 차이가 나는 선후배 관계고 핫토리 우노키치의 선생님은 시마다 고손이라고 하는 유명한 한학자였습니다. 그래서 핫토리 우노키치 같은 경우는 이제 시마다 고손의 후임으로서 그리고 철학과 교수로서 자리를 잡으면서 이 도쿄 제국대학의 교수로서 활약하게 됩니다. 그러면서 핫토리 우노키치의 꿈 중에 하나가 이제 근대화된 유학, 진화 철학을 가지고 진화 철학을 중심으로 하는 대학을 짓는 거였는데 그게 바로 이제 핫토리 우노키치가 참여하게 된 경성제국대학 창설위원회가 됩니다. 이 경성제국대학 창설위원회 위원장으로서 핫토리 우노키치가 일을 하면서 1926년 이제 본원이 개교할 때 초대 총장으로서 이제 자리를 서게 됩니다. 핫토리 우노키치 같은 경우는 뭐 핫토리 우노키치 이전에도 이제 총장이라고 이제 경성제국대학사를 보면은 몇 명이 있는데 이제 그거 같은 경우는 예교로서의 총장인 거고 핫토리 우노키치는 경성제국대학 이제 본원으로서의 총장을 하게 됩니다. 뭐 또한 뭐 문부성 서기관이나 그리고 핫토리 우노키치 같은 경우는 문부성 서기관이나 또 이제 하버드 대학의 교환 교수 등으로 가면서 여기저기 진화 철학에 대한 저변을 넓히는데 노력을 하게 됩니다. 자, 이제 좀 빠르게 이제 넘어가서 이제 관계도를 보시면은 이렇게 되는데 이제 이노우에 데츠지로, 핫토리 우노키치, 다카다 신지가 있는데 요거는 후지츠카 치카시나 가토조겐, 아베 요시오 같은 경우의 인물들도 있고 후지츠카 치카시 같은 경우는 경성제국대학에서 교수를 했고 가토조겐은 다카다 신지가 45년에 교수에서 이게 잘린 이후에 이어서 교수를 하게 되는 인물이 됩니다. 조금, 네, 지금 20분이 넘어가지고, 빠르게 그냥 나머지를 하려고 하는데, 이제 사문회라는 것이 그들이 했었던, 이제 중심으로 진화 철학파가 활약을 했었던 학회인데, 요 사문회라는 것이 있고, 요 사문회 같은 경우는 무엇을 했냐면은, 이제 경학원이나 이런 우리나라의 경학원, 성균관이 일본의 일제를 들어서 이제 경학원이라는 곳으로 이름을 받게 되는데, 요것과 교류를 하면서, 이제 유림들의 친일화에도 엄청나게 노력을 했었다라는 것을 볼 수 있고요. 이게 이제 경학원 잡지에 실린 핫토리 오노키치가 했었던 발언에 대한 내용입니다. 한번 쭉 읽어보시면 좋을 것 같고요. 여기가 이제 경성 제국대, 아까 얘기했던 핫토리 오노키치, 이제 그 진화 철학파들이 도쿄 제국대를 넘어서 이제 조선에서까지 어떤 활동을 했는가에 대한 이제 것을 설명하기 위해서 올렸습니다. 그래서 일본 사상, 일본 철학을 한다는 것에 있어서는 크게 뭐 세 가지 의의가 이렇게 있다고 보면 되는데, 첫 번째로는 뭐 어떠한 어떠한 영향을 끼쳤는가, 전쟁에 있어서 어떠한 이데올로기로서 어떤 영향을 끼쳤는가, 그리고 동양 철학이라는 것에 대한 방법론으로서 현재 우리나라나 중국에서 연구되는 동양 철학이라는 분야의 연구법이라는 게 사실 예전에 한문학과랑 같지는 않거든요. 그래서 이거를 어, 왜 이런 방식으로 바뀌게 되었는가에 대해서 알아볼 수 있는 방법이고, 세 번째로는 이제 그 일본에서는 아까 션 선생님께서 얘기해 주셨듯이 이 시기에 유교에 대한 연구를 하지 않습니다. 왜냐면은 이 당시가 터부 시대고 이 그들에게 치부가 되기 때문에. 근데 그 때문에 당시 일본 철학이 어떻게 발전되게 되는가, 어떤 방식으로 진화되게 됐는가에 대한 그 연구 자체가 돼 있지는 않습니다. 그래서 그 블랭크를 어떻게 보면 채워나갈 수 있는 연구가 되지 않나라는 생각을 합니다. 일단 오늘 발표는 여기까지 마치겠고요. 질문을 이충재 선생님과 함께 이따가 받도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
All right, thank you so much, Junhyun. How about we move on to our next speaker? Our next speaker will be Yu Tang Jin. Yu Tang Jin, are you ready? Yu Tang. Oh, Yu Tang. Oh, I can't seem to. Could you please try speaking again? Oh, your sound is very soft for some reason.
Can you hear me? Is it
Yes, that's
better?
better. That's much better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. It's really old earphones.
Oh.
I want to thank Shaun first for inviting me to be a discussant. I must confess I knew very little about the two figures addressed in the chapters before reading them. So I will be offering my comments from the perspectives that I do have some expertise about. I don't have slides to share. Just I will quickly summarize the arguments that I see from chapters and then offer two comments. So it seems that Chungjae Lee argues that Lee Gwang-su used the critique, and I quote, the critique of Confucianism as a means to reconstruct Koreanness, and by which he means the spirit of self-reliance and communal living. In doing so, Chungjae Lee not only examined explicitly political essays written by Lee Gwang-su, but also novels which were written in a way that resonates with his political ideas. And I think this is really fascinating. I mean, I guess the work itself, the argument itself is a little bit controversial given current political climate in South Korea. So I think I really like the argument. For the other chapter, I think Junhyun Park focuses on the narrative of rectification of names. For those familiar with Confucianism, rectification of names is a hugely important concept in Confucian classics. And Park discussed this idea in the writings of Takada. The Park argues that Takada creatively used the Confucian concept of rectification of names to realize the goal of empowering the emperor under a stable, moralized social order, where, and I quote, each individual should occupy a position indicated by their title and fulfill the duties of their status. In making this move, Takada's practical approach offered, and I quote, an excuse for rationalizing the legitimacy of a particular type of political regime. Okay, so I just want to make two comments. They're both generic. So one on methodology and the other on nationalism. So my first comment is on two ways in which Confucianism is invoked and debated in political theory, and how these two works fit into this bigger picture. But of course, we can make distinctions in various different ways. But I see two important ways in which we can really do Confucian political theory. So for centuries, Confucianism has been taken in many parts of East Asia as the philosophy, and as such, it has been deeply intertwined with politics, intellectual life, and the social ethos. The mainstream, at least in Anglophone scholarship today, is to conceive of Confucianism as a philosophy and discuss how this philosophy can inform and improve contemporary political theory. And I understand highly debated topics of Confucian meritocracy and democracy as falling into this category. But these two chapters we see today, they are different. They belong to a different genre. And what is distinctive of them is the significance they attribute to how Confucianism actually unfolded in intellectual thought and social practice as East Asian societies wrestled with modern challenges. And the two authors are acutely aware of the historical context where Confucianism was debated under renewed social conditions. Um, and they give us a sense of history, which is lacking in the fast-growing literature on Confucian meritocracy and democracy. So it's never the case that Confucian ideas suddenly jumped out of the classic texts to suddenly take an interest in democracy and constitutional order, but it's deeply intertwined with the intellectual and social fabrics of the society, whose value got negotiated and debated throughout history. And I also want to add that the authors also tell us that historicity ironically involves a degree of ahistoricity. So why? Because if you closely read these two chapters, when Li Guangsu and Takada Shinji they put up a fight with or within Confucianism, they must pluck it out of the early text and context of Confucius, Mencius, and Xunzi, and interpret Confucianism in a way that serves the political purposes of their times. So both emphasize that Confucianism was wrong, not necessarily because of its departure from philosophical truth, but because it's deeply unsuitable for serving the needs of their respective nations. So far so good, but my concern is if Confucianism is only used as a foil for a separate political agenda, then the questions missing are first, whether for these two thinkers, Confucianism is also wrong or lacking from a philosophical perspective. I mean, in terms of the universal claims about moral order Confucians make. And more importantly, how that separate political agenda or goal is morally justified. So I give you some examples. So from the chapter and also from the presentation, we can learn from Chungjae Lee's work that Li Guangsu criticized Confucianism for undermining solidarity among Koreans, undermining Koreanness. But is there a sense of Koreanness to begin with in the first place? And if so, is it valuable as a political ideal? So if there is no eternal morality, as we can see from the presentation, then why is fostering Koreanness a noble ideal? And we can't possibly know the answer by solely focusing on Confucianism. And similarly, we learn from Park's work that Takada singled out and justified the rectification of names for a new purpose. But why is it a new, why is this new purpose a noble political ideal for Takada? And my concern, to be clear, my concern is not that the authors, these two authors, they should justify the goals endorsed by the figures they study. This is not my point. So, but my point is, we as contemporaries know that in hindsight, the ideals they justify are no longer ideals for us, for sure, and they're horrible for various reasons. But my point is, we are interested to know what these figures themselves offered as a justification of their political goals, uh, as normative ideals, independently of what they have got to say about Confucianism. And readers are interested in this for their critique or attack on Confucianism can be coherent only if they offer a consistent defense of their respective political goals, whose value apparently doesn't partially or fully depend on Confucianism. Right, so this is my kind of short comment on methodology. And I have also something to say about nationalism. So following my first remark, my second comment is on, what Li Guangsu and Takada Shinji were trying to defend by invoking or rejecting Confucianism. As you can see, the unique wartime period was really fascinating period. It was intertwined with Western influence. And I think it reveals nationalism as a candidate topic worthy of explanation. So it'd be a gross mistake to simply see their thought as a reactionary force in defense of local tradition. And I seriously doubt whether there is a genuine local tradition to start with. And as can be seen from these chapters, Li Guangsu was concerned with the internal, and I quote, the internal division within the nation, and tried to present a distinct anti-assimilationist vision of a unified Korean nation, right? And also, I think the author mentioned national self-determination, which is a concept that really struck me a lot. And also, Takada felt it, and I quote, imperative to stress government policy and deliver a message to Japanese society. So it seems to me that a significant common ground shared by Lee and Takada is that they were reorienting discourse on Confucianism to put forward their visions of nation building for their respective countries. And what seems to be doing normative heavy lifting here is the value of nationalism. And it is nationalism rather than Confucianism that is playing a huge part in the social fabrics of East Asian societies today, as it was back then in the times of Li Guangsu and Takada. At the time of their writing, Korea just emerged as emerged from the tutelage of China, but it soon again, it became a colony of Japan, and Japan was charting a new path forward, exploring new norms in the absence of long-standing assumptions of about tradition and continuity. So what emerges is not only the task of how to construe Japan and Korea if they are no longer loosely connected traditional communities, but also the task of grasping rapidly changing internal relationships between different classes, between different social groups, and so on. And Charles Taylor famously argued that nationalism is part of modernity. And I really want to quote Taylor here. So it is and I quote, a typically modern way of responding to the threat represented by the advancing wave of modernization. So nationalism is not empowered by an urge to pursue a common good or an ideal, but by a sense of urgency in the collective matter of survival and death, as well as in the matter of collective dignity and humiliation. So the elites are most likely the first to experience a dramatic loss of dignity in the face of concurring power. And one way of responding to that threat is to revamp traditional culture, as Takada did. And another way is to reject it and embrace something new. And this seems to be, what Li Guangsu embraced. And Taylor's insight is helpful here because it helps to show why Confucianism becomes a thorny point of reference in a way that it was not seen in traditional pre-modern societies. And we can also see that in light of nationalism, Lee and Takada, they're not that different after all, even if one drew on nationalism and the other rejected, one drew on Confucianism and the other rejected Confucianism. They were both theorizing on the same terrain of nationalism by mobilizing intellectual sources at their disposal. So with this as a background, whether Confucianism is the opposite of or vehicle for nation building, I think we must ask why nation building itself is morally desirable and what kind of nation building is desirable. Perhaps there is a dose of irony in asking a universally valid justification for nationalism, because nationalism in East Asia, at least in its early stage, has always been a particularistic response to Western universalism. But not asking questions about the value of nationalism would come at a cost nobody would be willing to bear. That's conceding that nations are particular communities which are free to define their goals, that are in turn, uh, not up for, universal assessment. Then what is the role of Confucianism in this, picture of nationalism? Perhaps Confucianism is neither a natural ally or an enemy of horrible forms of nationalism we see in wartime East Asia. But prayer questions to ask, as revealed by the study of these two figures, are what made wartime nationalism wrong? And if wartime nationalism went wrong, so when I say wartime nationalism, I'm not only referring to wartime nationalism in Japan, but also, kind of nationalism we see in Korea. And is there any plausible form of nationalism? And if so, what does it look like and what makes it desirable? And short of discussions of this sort, focusing on nationalism, we are left wondering whether we are missing the forest for the trees. Um, and by primarily focusing on Confucianism, it's doubtful if we can really go beyond a historical awareness about Confucianism to see whether any form of nationalism independent of Confucianism can be justified, and what role Confucianism can play in that, in that new justified form of nationalism. Um, and if we ask these questions about nationalism, then we are likely to face a mixed bag, in the same way that we are likely to face a mixed bag when we examine whether Confucianism stands for or against kind of horrible forms of nationalism we see in wartime Japan and Korea. And for example, Li Guangsu's idea, so that's entirely my feeling. Li Guangsu's charge against Confucianism may be overstated, insofar as the Confucian emphasis on partiality may help Koreans foster a sense of solidarity. So, what is partiality? So, moral standards built on partiality defend the way in which moral obligations to those close to us have a heavier weight than our moral obligations to those from afar. And to that extent, Confucianism can be mobilized to help nation building. But Confucianism, historically bred a political hierarchy that kept ordinary people passive and submissive. That's also true, which stands opposite of Lee's emphasis on deliberate action. And Takada Shinji's idea of rectification of names, of course, if you take it as in the original form, resulted in a form of nationalism we deplore. But the proper use of rectification of names may help to facilitate modern citizens' mutual recognition and affirmation as citizens, our status as eco-citizens, and perhaps Confucianism has also, in the form of rectification of names, also has a role to play in the new form of nationalism. To put my remark briefly, it seems to me that why these horrible forms of nationalism arose in the first place, and what trace of them is still felt today in Japan, Korea, and whether Confucianism can combat them and usher in civil forms of nationalism. I think these questions are as important as the historical context of wartime Confucianism. But I'm not trying to diminish the value of historical works. It is only because we have historical works that we can build on that and then ask more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your comments, Yutang Jin. I think we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. I actually want to ask first if the speakers want to respond to Yutang Jin's comments first. Yep.
I can go. So first of all, thank you so much for your great commentary. It's very important that the questions you're raising. So let me just go one by one. So methodology issue. Um, Now, I think if I understand you correctly, please correct me if I misunderstand you, Yutong. So I think when it comes to methodology, I think your question is that if Lee is rejecting universalism, then to what extent is his call for national reconstruction justified without universal foundation? Now, I think that's your question. And I think the answer is not really in the chapter, but I have written another one on Lee's political thought, where Lee argues that he's make a distinction between universal moral foundation as opposed to universal condition. So universal principles as that like you should behave, so normative foundation. So he doesn't accept that. However, he does accept universal condition, and from his perspective, universal condition is nation or nationalism. So he argues that a human being is necessarily a national being, which is kind of radical claim. And that's the reason why he thinks that this call for natural reconstruction is justified, not in the name of moral principle, but that given universal human condition as such. And then he gives examples of like Socrates or Frederick the Great in Germany, or even Meiji Restoration in the case of Japan, or Xinhai Revolution in China. So that's kind of distinction. Now I think your second question is much more contemporary and interesting. That is to say that um, is it possible to have nationalism independent of Confucianism? And if so, what will be more foundation in the contemporary sense? Um, I think I really don't know, but I think when it comes to Lee's case, I don't think he was trying to find moral foundation per se, but rather he was appropriating multiple resources or ideas that was available from his perspective. So he was appropriating, it's not that he had a kind of correct or accurate understanding of Confucianism, but rather he appropriating whatever resources that was available from his perspective. And I think the thinker, contemporary thinker that comes to my mind making this argument is Li Jinko, I think it's changing reference, where she's making a similar claim that it's kind of Western learning. It wasn't so much as so to have correct understanding the West, which is of course arbitrary because it's unclear what it means the West in the first place, but rather it was kind of practical appropriation. So I think from Li's perspective, or for that matter, any other political thinkers in colonial Korea at the time, the question of accurate understanding of the text was a less priority. Rather, the priority was kind of this practical value of all these ideas. So that and your final question, what's the value of Confucianism in dealing with kind of dark side of nationalism or ethnocentrism and so on and so forth? I'm sure many of the people participating here are familiar with the work of Confucian democracy and Sung Kim and all that, so I think that may be one option. Um, but I really don't have much to say on that point because I'm not really particularly have some expertise on that debate, like meritocratic and Confucian democratic side arguments. So I would just refrain from making any comment because I don't want to say something that is not beyond my expertise. So I hope you understand.
All right, thank you, Chungjae. Junhyun, did you want to respond at all?
Uh, well, there was very many type of questions, so I was thought about it, but only one, especially one thing I was keep in my head. So I wanted to talk about nationalism with just wait. Uh, can is it okay to, by the way, answer by Korean or is
Yes,
it?
of course, of course.
Oh, okay. 어, 일단 유탕 선생님께서 아까 지적해 주신 내용 중에서 국가주의라는 내용이 사실 내셔널리즘에 대한 내용이 저는 계속 머릿속에서 이제 맴돌게 됐는데, 그래서 좀 전부 다 지금 뭐 답변 드리기에는 사실 많은 내용이기도 하고 저도 고민을 하고 있는 내용이라 국가주의로서의 어떻게 보면 정명에 대해서 얘기를 좀 해본다고 하면은 이게 무엇을 지키려고 했는가라는 좀 얘기가 아까 마음에 걸리더라고요. 도대체 그들이 다카다가 무엇을 지키고자 했는가라는 게 일본이라는 저는 당연히 그게 어떻게 보면은 일본이랑 국채 자체를 다카다는 그냥 지키고자 했던 거 아닐까라는 생각을 사실 했었는데 이 일본이라는 국채를 지킨다라는 건 사실 그한테는 맞지가 않는 거고 어떻게 보면은 다카다가 원했던 거는 질서지 않을까라는 생각도 하게 돼요. 이 정명이라는 게
어,
사실
선생님, 잠깐만 제가 번역을 좀
네,
해도 될까요?
네네네.
So one of the things that I think Takada wanted to promote or protect was not necessarily the Japanese entity or the nation of Japan itself, but probably it was about the order.
음, 그래서 이 국채 이게 질서라는 게 어떻게 보면은 우리가 생각하는 이제 그냥 질서라는 거는 일본, 지금 현대 일본을 보면 알 수 있듯이 되게 사람들이 질서 정연하게 있다라기보다도 당시에 쇼와 시대라는 시대는 우리가 역사적으로 잘 알지, 뭐 아는 사람도 있고 모르는 사람들도 있지만 굉장히 많은 사건이 있었고 또 일본 내부에서도 굉장히 혼란스러웠던 시기예요.
So
네.
during the time of Showa, so like what I mean by order is not necessarily the orderliness that you see in contemporary Japan, but it's more based on the historical context of the Showa era, because there were many disputes and many events going on there.
특히 그 쇼와 시대 때 제일 많았던 게 뭐냐, 쿠데타거든요, 쿠데타. 아,
There were a lot of coups at the time.
이제 뭐 황도파라고 불리는 사람들의 쿠데타부터 해가지고 단순히 그냥 지역 군인들에 의한 쿠데타 그리고 제일 대표적인 게 이제 226 사건이라는 게 이제 제 논문에도 저 챕터에도 있지만 226 사건이라는 사건도 있을 정도로 많은 쿠데타가 있었어요.
So there are a lot of cuts, including 226 incident and other ones by the military. So it was really disorganized at the time.
음. E- Especially the group of the imperialism is imperial ways
Mm.
one of the biggest incidents. But 네, 이 국가주의, 이러한 쿠데타가 많다 보니까 사회가 굉장히 혼란스러웠고, 일본 내부에서도 어떻게 보면은 황도라는 내용이 나온 게 저는, 그러니까 결국에는 이 황도라는 내용에, 그룹까지 올라가게 되는데, 이 황도라는 내용이 과연 일본이라는 나라에 대해서 선전을 하고 일본을 지키려고 했었던 것인가 였었는데, 처음에는 이 내용이 결국에는 일본인들에게 주는 메시지, 결국엔 이 당시 이데올로기는 일본인들에게 무언가 메시지를 전하고자 했던 것이 아닐까라는 생각이 들더라고요.
So the Hwangdo faction that I was referring to probably was intended not just to sort of like protect the Japanese nation, but given the circumstances at that time, they wanted to give a message to the Japanese people.
그래가지고 이 홍도 같은 경우는 사실 지금까지 많은 연구들에서는 대외적으로 중국, 조선에게 이 국가를 알리고 일본이라는 나라를 이제 서- 이, 그 선전국으로서 프로파간다로서 사용을 하려고 했었다라는 얘기가 있는데 오히려 다카다의 연구나 아니면 다른 이제 야스오카 같은 연구를 보면은 결국에는 일본인들에게 일본인으로서 어떻게 해야 되는가에 대한 얘기가 사실 좀 더 많거든요. 어.
So the works, especially by Takada, argue that like Hwangdo faction was not justly, so they were not trying to propagate, so or use the Japanese history as a propagate against vis-a-vis China or other countries, but at least like it was internally focused, which was they really wanted to kind of tell people that at least there's a so and ask Japanese people what it means to live as a Japanese citizen or Japanese person. So that was I see that's kind of one of the key goals of Hwangdo faction.
네, 그래가지고 이제 결국에는 어떻게 보면은 무엇을 지키려고 했는가라는 무엇을 지키려고 했는가라는 것은 결국 국가주의라기보다는 일본인들에게 요구하는 그들이 생각하는 정치적 이상을 향하기 위한 질서를 요구하기 위해서 그들은 정명이나 황도를 주장한 게 아닐까라는 생각도 들어서 이제 국가주의로서도 볼 수 있지만 어떻게 보면은 이 내셔널리즘이라는 국가주의로서도 볼 수 있지만 어떻게 보면은 단속과 규율이라는 것으로도 우리는 생각할 수 있지 않을까라고 생각을 합니다. 예, 일단 시간상 여기까지.
Yeah. So sinological philosophy that I explained during my presentation was it's more I see it as focused on order and discipline for the Japanese people rather than just promoting like nationalism that Yutan just rightly pointed out.
Thank you, Ken. Is there any question?
Yeah, actually,
Can I
Joseph,
reply?
are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. Maybe time for a quick question?
Yeah, please go ahead. Sorry, Francis.
That's fine. My class needs to leave soon. Just had a quick question and comment and question. My comment was, Dr. Lee, you mentioned like how Gwang-su moved from anti-assimilation to blatant pro-assimilation. So using a language like blatant pro-assimilation makes assimilation sound, it frames it as kind of negative, right? And so I think as a scholar, we want to try to use as much objective, neutral language as we can. So maybe instead of using blatant, like pro-assimilation, we can just say pro-assimilation. That's that was comment number one. And then my general question is, my students are wondering, can you discuss Korean academic sensitivities to colonial history and how this was impacted by the book Anti-Japan Tribalism? Okay, that's it. Thank you. Dr. Lee, maybe you can address that first?
Yes, so I think so I appreciate your comment here. But I think the reason why I used blatant nationalism was not to make any objective appraisal or evaluation of whether assimilation is good or bad, but rather I was referring from the perspective of his contemporaries, meaning the Lee Kwang-su's. So I think that is the reason why I use blatant as opposed to pro-assimilation. But I do understand that as an academic terminology issue, maybe when addressing the issue of pro or anti-assimilation, I think pro is a better option. So thank you for that suggestion. And I'm not sure about the second comment. So is it for me or is it for general audience or?
It's for the speakers, and then I was wondering about how like academic sensitivity to colonial history. I was wondering how easy or how difficult it is for academics to write about colonial history, and how and 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 if this was impacted, if any at all, by the anti-Japan tribalism book.
I'm s- I I'm sorry, but I'm not familiar with the book you're referring to, so I have a limited comment as to regarding the book. But I'm happy to comment on this idea of dealing with colonial history. But I don't want to monopolize the floor right now, so I would like to hand it over to Junhyun if he has something to say about the book he's referring. I mean, Joseph is referring to.
준현 선생님, 제가 좀 설명을 해드리면, 최근에 몇 년 전에 이제 한국에서 반일 종족주의라고 낙성대
네,
연구소 그 이영훈 교수님 팀이 출간한 책이 있잖아요.
네,
사실은 이제 그런 연구들이 현재 선생님이나 아니면 뭐 이충재 교수님이 하고 있는 이런 어떤 콜로니얼 시기 피리어드의 어떤 한국 학자들의 연구에 혹시나 뭐 어떤 영향이 있거나 뭔가 아니면 조금은 임팩트가 있었다면 뭐 간략하게라도 좀 소개해 주신다면, 왜냐하면 한국에서 굉장히 그 책이 출간됐을 때 사실은 어떤 그런 내셔널리즘 정서가 상당히 이렇게 에스노 내셔널리스트하게 그게 있었잖아요. 그러니까
네.
그런 어떤 분위기가 지금 선생님이 하고 있는 연구에 어떻게 영향을 미치는지 좀
음.
그런 경험이나 뭐 아니면 짧은 소견이라도 좀 말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
기본적으로 이제 반일 종족주의 책 자체는 이제 반일 종족주의 책에 대한 이야기와 제 연구 필드에 대한 얘기를 좀 나눠서 해야 될 것 같은데, 반일 종족주의의 경우는 일본에서도 반영이 많이 됐었던 것 같아요. 특히 조선사 연구회나 아니면 이제 한국 역사학을 연구하는 쪽에서는 굉장히 문제가 되고 성명서까지 실제로 나왔어요. 거기서 이제 오히려 일본 내에서도 조선사라고 일본에서는 한국사를 가지고 조선사라고 부르는데, 조선사 연구자들 사이에서는 대다수가 이제 반대를 하고 오히려 그거에 대해서 맞서는 연구들이 많이 나오기도 했고,
Oh, okay. So,
네.
when the book was published, actually, within the Japanese academia, actually, there are a lot of Japanese scholars who study Korean studies there that were against the arguments in anti-Japanese nationalism. The book published by Dr. Lee Young-un and his team.
네. 그리고 또 거의 학계에서는 사실 뭐 좀 과격하게 얘기할 수도 있지만 관심을 주지 말자. 이게 가장 컸죠. 취급하지 말자. 네.
So the tense atmosphere of the Japanese academia at that time was that they didn't want to even give pay any attention to the book and to the arguments there.
사실 비슷한 부류의 책이 일본에서는 워낙 예전부터 많았어서
Since there are similar books published in Japan that made similar arguments in the past.
재밌는 게 큰 서점을 가면은 그 섹션이 있어요. 그러한 부류 이제 반한 혹은 아니면은 한국 스스로 이제 일본 역사학에 있어서 이영훈 선생 같은 이야기를 하는 사람들에 대한 책만 모아두는 코너가 따로 있어요.
Even in Japanese bookstore, if you go there, there are some sections where they stockpile or they collect the books that that speak to the similar arguments written by Lee Young-hun.
그래서 일단 일본 학계에서는 그런 반응이라고 치면은 이제 사상 연구에 있어서는 오히려 모르는 경우도 많았었다. 일단 사상 연구 쪽에서는 이영훈의 저서에 대해서는 모르는 사람들도 많았었다라는 게 첫 번째고.
So in political theory circle, actually, there are very few people who are aware of Lee Young-hun's work.
네, 그리고 제 연구에 있어서는 오히려 영향이 거의 어떻게 보면 일본 학계에서는 너무 아까도 얘기했듯이 많았었던 이야기와 주제다 보니 별로 그렇게 크게까지 타격이 있거나 하지는 않고 저의 연구에 있어서 그렇게까지 많은 반향이 있지도 않았었다, 오히려. 네.
I want to say that my own research wasn't impacted by the publications as such, because those works by Lee Young-hun, it's now is a kind of cliche, right? So his arguments became a cliche, among the Japanese scholars there. So I wasn't impacted much.
네, 그래가지고 이제 한국하고 일본에서 뭐 활동을 하는 연구자들 사이에서도 반일종족주의에 관한 이야기 나오면 오히려 일본 쪽에서는 반응을 안 하고 한국 쪽에서 좀 더 민감하게 반응을 하는 편이다라고 보면 될 것 같습니다.
So it seems that compared to Japanese scholars, it is usually Korean scholars who gets really sensitive and sometimes who gets really kind of irritated by the arguments made by books such as Lee Young-hun's anti-Japanese nationalism.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you, Junhyun and Andy. I see that John McCreary has put in a comment in the chat. John, did you have a specific question for any of the speakers? John seems to have left his desk.
Okay, but
All right. Are there any other questions? Perhaps.
Yeah, but I think John recommended some authors there, so it might be helpful to take note of that. Like question number 2C, Joseph Levinson. Yeah, there are some scholars that he's referring to there.
John's back.
Oh, perfect.
John, you're
okay.
on mute.
I think he's just unmuting.
There we go. I just unmuted. How's that?
Good, thank you. I was just saying, I saw you'd put a comment in the chat. Did you have a specific question for any of the speakers?
Well, not so much a specific question for the speakers because I arrived late, having just come from a doctor's appointment. but especially for the comments at the end, it stirred up a number of thoughts in my mind. The first was the reason I mentioned Joe Levinson is because he's one of the first authors I came across who really understood that ideas do not exist as simply as ideas. And he remarks very shrewdly that the whole business about Confucian China and its modern fate is about, it rests on the proposition that I think he takes ultimately from Alfred North Whitehead, that basically, if you look at Confucianism in 18th century China at the height of the Qing dynasty, to be a Confucian was to believe in something you believed to actually be universally true. When you move into the 19th and early 20th century, you're looking at Chinese who, confronted with Western technology and science, are forced to say, whoops, it can't all be true. But then there is no one single response. But there's a range of responses from people like Hu Shi, who basically say the whole thing is feudal nonsense, get rid of it entirely. There's the reactionary view that we got to preserve it. And there's a whole range of people in between. But what has happened to the people in between is that what had been an intellectual commitment to belief in what you thought to be universally true about the world had become an emotional commitment to an ethnic identity. That was that thing. The other thing that I was thinking from having the work he did on translating Shaun's first collection of stuff about Confucianism was that I think it's really important to recognize that the Japanese were responding not simply to Confucianism, but they were responding to Western imperialism. To me, the most imperial, and trying to project Japan as the Western, as the East's equivalent of the Western imperial powers. This is a fascinating idea, and I have no scholarship to back it up whatsoever. So this I leave up to you guys. But I heard that what I read there was that Japan was basically looking at the West and he said, look, all of these guys, all these Western countries insist that they are doing God's work, because they weren't just spreading nationalism, they were spreading Christianity. And their justifications were in terms of God's will, God's on our side. And they figured they needed an absolute divinity too. Thus you have the thrust in Japanese reinterpretations of Confucianism focused on the idea of the divinity of the emperor, who then becomes an absolute authority in the way that the Christian God is for the Western imperialists. But then one other thing, this is the third thing that just sort of struck me that I recalled from that book, was someone mentioned that I thought that the Japanese approach to rationalizing what they were doing was not to reject Chinese Confucianism. It was the author used a terrific term. They relegated it. Like in the soccer leagues. If you're not in the top league, you get relegated down to one of the lower leagues. So their basic argument was that Mencius in particular had gotten it wrong, because the whole idea of the mandate of heaven and an emphasis on filial piety instead of loyalty and things like that basically gutted the idea that you were ruling in the way of the ancient sages. Whereas Japan, we've got the uninterrupted imperial line going all the way back to the gods. We've got the real stuff. And this is important. And why is talking about Confucianism important to them at all? It's important to them at all because they're looking for a space in which they can become an imperial power with its own justification for running an empire in their own region. And Confucianism is sort of what they imagine as the marker, not just of Japanese nationalism, but of the East Asian co-prosperity sphere. And I know these are just things that are running through my mind. I just throw them out there for people to bash at. Because like I said, I'm not a scholar in this dimension. I just sort of remember these things. I'm an anthropologist. We go look at things and then make up stuff based on what Kierkegaard said. If our insights are valuable at all, they're valuable not because of the microscopic places in which we discover them, but because they figure in larger conversations. Who knows? But over to you guys.
Thank you so much for your comment, John, and that interesting parallel between, I guess, the Christian and the reinterpreted Confucianism. Did any of the speakers have anything to say? I see Sean has his hand up.
Yes, I just wanted to say that John is being too modest in his self-assessment. That he and his wife Ruth, in their WordWorks translation company, translated numerous chapters in both my first edited volume, Handbook of Confucianism in Modern Japan, and in Confucianism at War. So he knows a great deal of what is being discussed, and I just wanted to thank John for his contribution.
Oh, my pleasure, man. I'm glad I could make it.
Thank you so much, Sean, and to John again. I see we've reached the half hour, so I see Yu Tang Jin has a question.
It's not a question. Actually, it's a kind of response, if I may, to the two speakers.
Mm.
So I think they kind of partly addressed my concerns. So I think Junhyun mentioned that Li Guangzu basically makes a distinction between universal ideals and universal conditions. And Li's idea is simply that, kind of nation is a basic unit, is a kind of as a part of universal conditions. And then my question is, why is that? Why should we take nation as a universal kind of unit in the first place? Does Li Guangzu has anything to say about this? And it kind of relates to Junhyun's kind of remark. His reply is that for Takada, what really matters, the goal, the telos of political order is not is kind of not nation, but kind of order, kind of moralized order under a universal kind of emperor. But the thing is, it seems that Takada takes the boundary or kind of citizenship, Japanese citizens for granted. So it seems that, imperial order for the Japanese. But so I was wondering, did Takada say anything about, kind of war and the Japanese effort to spread imperial way to other countries? And how can we configure the relationship between kind of like the Japanese people who first received imperial way and the other people who are ready to receive imperial way? Is there any hierarchy there, or are they just the same? They're all equal under the imperial way. Okay, thank you.
I was just going to say, sorry if I could interrupt. I think Junhyun could have addressed this better than me, but Takada wrote a very pivotal essay in 1942 called The Greater East Asian War and Shibun, Shibun being the journal of the Shibukukai organization, which Takada was the editor of. And there's a tremendous amount of very interesting information in that article. Perhaps Junhyun would because he's much more familiar with Takada than I, he could explain that. But yes, he has a great deal to say about war, and I think that had some say in him being purged from his position at at Tokyo Imperial University after the war. But I'll hand off to Junhyun to address this.
Well, thank you to explain, Sean. So Takada wrote a lot about the war, especially he even supporting the Hitler and writing about how Hitler is an amazing person and with the Japan and Germany has to be together and win this of the wartime and like those things. So surely he also towering to the nationalism. But when I'm thinking about the imperial way, surely imperial way is it is also connected with second question, but the imperial way is surely different. They understand differently. Each scholars and Takada's imperial way, as I think, was about the order and it's like a group. They wanted to make a team as under the order. So, it's more instead of not about the nationalism, but it's different type of nationalism. It's not what we formally talking about nationalism, but it's Japan's usually using type of the Japanese, like a Japanese nationalism or Japanese thinking. So also surely their Confucianism is not normal compared to the Chinese or the Korean as they read. Even the reflected of the name is different compared to how the Chinese people understand or the Korean people understand historically. So Japan's imperial way has a rule from up to the down, the power has to work. And second, it is the order and the principle for their nation. So it basically, after all that, then it's gonna be great country. So at my one journal, I wrote he making all his ideal instead. I use the word ideal instead of the nationalism or the other words, but how do I say? So so I think first it is about the order and not nationalism, but on the other hand, he is supporting the war and mention about the war earlier. So he is the rooting on the war. And second, it was the imperial way. If I answer simply, second is the imperial ways. Even between the Takada and who I said Inoue Tetsujiro, they are having a little different type of the imperial way too. Yeah.
Thank you, Junhyun, for your thoughtful answer, and Yu Tangjin for your question. I think just taking a look, then it looks like we don't have any more questions, and we've had a bit of drop off already. So perhaps now would be a good spot to close. What do you think, Shaun?
Yeah, I think it would be fine to finish now.
Sure, perfect. Well, thank you so much to the speakers for coming and sharing your knowledge in actually something that I don't think we've really covered in our East Asia chapter before. So this is all very new. So thank you so much for sharing all of your scholarly expertise on Confucianism and your perspectives on that.